Just sign, Astraea. Lavinia hissed in my ear, her breath cold against my skin. No one here's a ghost. But Judge Vane stepped down from his bench, bowing low before me. Honor is restored, Chairman Thorne, he said, his voice echoing through the stunned silence. Cyprian's face turned a deathly gray as he saw the signet mark. The debt. It's you? You've owned us this whole time? His knees struck the marble with a sickening thud. As he fell, the courtroom blurred into that freezing night at the Drake Hotel. Back to the moment the first layer of this beautiful lie was wrapped tightly around my body. The white silk of my dress felt less like a garment and more like a shroud. It was a masterpiece of restriction, designed by my mother, Lavinia, specifically to make me look delicate, fragile enough to be broken, innocent enough to be ignored. As I stood in the grand ballroom of the Drake Hotel, the corset pulled so tight it stole my breath. I realized that in this family, being the youngest didn't mean being the most loved. It meant being the most manageable. The gold leaf ceilings and the heavy scent of lilies in the air were supposed to signify the Thorne Global legacy, but to me, they just felt like the gilded bars of a cage. I watched the elite of Chicago sip champagne, their laughter echoing off the marble floors like shattered glass. Thorne Global was celebrating its 30th anniversary, a milestone built on my grandfather's integrity, but currently rotting under my father's greed. I knew what the ledgers really said. I knew about the hollow accounts and the mounting debts. Yet here we were, draped in luxury, performing a play for an audience that thrived on appearances. Being a family doesn't mean sharing a heartbeat. Sometimes it just means sharing a cage, and tonight, the lock was about to turn. "You look so charming," Milas whispered, leaning closer with a smile that didn't reach her sister's cold eyes. My sister reached out, gently stroking a non-existent wrinkle on my shoulder with an icy touch. "But you look a little pale. Perhaps the stress of Grandpa's death is finally affecting your frail health." She offered me a glass of water, her gaze lingering for a second. I took it, my hand steady though a sudden chill ran down my spine. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my strength. In this house, silence was the only armor I had left. The music shifted, becoming something grander, more predatory. My father, Cyprian Thorne, stepped onto the stage, the blinding spotlights catching the silver at his temples. He was the image of the stoic patriarch, a man who commanded the room with a single glance. He gestured for me to join him, and as I climbed the steps, the world began to tilt. The water I had sipped tasted of a faint, metallic bitterness. My vision blurred at the edges, the faces in the crowd dissolving into smears of light and shadow, but deep inside, my mind remained a sharp, cold diamond. "My friends," Cyprian's voice boomed, rich with a simulated sorrow that made my stomach churn. "As many of you know, the loss of my father has taken a heavy toll on our family, most notably on my youngest daughter, Astraea." He placed a heavy, possessive hand on my shoulder, anchoring me to the spot as my knees threatened to buckle. "It breaks a father's heart to admit that she has suffered a permanent cognitive decline. She is no longer able to navigate the complexities of her own life." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom, followed by a heavy, suffocating silence. I watched through a haze as a lawyer stepped forward, placing a set of guardianship papers on the mahogany podium. With a flourish that felt like a public execution, my father signed my life away, handing the legal reins of my existence over to Melis. They weren't just protecting me, they were legalizing my disappearance. I realized then that this wasn't a party, it was a hunt. Cruelty always needs a stage, but true kindness is a quiet act. I wasn't losing my mind. For the first time in 26 years, I was seeing the Thorne legacy for exactly what it was, a beautiful lie. The drug was pulling me under, a heavy curtain of fog descending over my senses, but I reached into the hidden pocket of my dress. My fingertips brushed against the cold, jagged edge of my grandfather's signet ring. It was a tactile anchor, a reminder of the man who had seen this coming and had prepared me for the fight. Have you ever trusted someone you shouldn't have, only to find the strength to save yourself in the memory of the one person who truly loved you? As the applause died down, Lavinia stepped up to me, pressing a Judas kiss against my cheek. Her perfume was cloying, the scent of expensive roses masking the rot of her betrayal. "Don't fight it, Astraea," she whispered into my ear, her voice a sharp contrast to the pitying look she gave the cameras. "It's for the best. You are always too weak for the Thorne name." I looked at her, my eyes heavy but burning with a clarity she couldn't comprehend. "A name is just a collection of letters, Mother. It's the character behind it that carries the weight." I felt a surge of pity for her. She had spent her whole life guarding a name while losing her soul. Miley gripped my arm, her fingers digging into my skin as she began to lead me off the stage, toward the side exit where a black town car waited to ferry me to my new prison. The elite of Chicago watched me go, their faces a mix of pity and relief that the Thorne tragedy was being handled so gracefully. I felt like a prisoner being led to the gallows, but as we passed the service entrance, I caught a glimpse of a man in a waiter's uniform. It was Soren Voss. He didn't move, didn't speak, but our eyes locked for a fraction of a second. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod, a signal that the dead man's switch had been tripped. The family thought they were burying a secret, but they didn't realize they were planting a seed. I looked at the hotel's revolving doors as we approached them, knowing that when I returned, I wouldn't be the daughter they thought they could bury. The heavy oak doors of the Thorne estate closed behind me with a finality that felt like a gavel striking stone. I was no longer Astraea Thorne, the daughter of a legacy. I was a package being returned to a warehouse. The sedative they had slipped me at the Drake Hotel began to lose its grip, replaced by a cold, jagged clarity that burned through the fog in my mind. They had locked me in my third-story bedroom, a space that was supposed to be a sanctuary, but now felt like a high-security cell. I didn't panic. Panic is a luxury for those who still have something to lose, and as I dragged myself toward my desk, I suspected my losses were already absolute. I lunged for the floorboard beneath my nightstand, my fingers trembling as I pried it loose to find my emergency safety net. My breath hitched. The space was empty. No backup phone. No emergency cash. No copies of my grandfather's private journals. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird in a bone cage. I scrambled to my dresser, tearing through drawers with a desperation that left silk scarves and lace scattered like fallen leaves. My social security card was gone. My birth certificate, usually kept in a fireproof sleeve, had been replaced by a single, crisp sheet of paper. It was a legal declaration of non-existence. Thorne Global's lawyers had worked fast, filing a petition that claimed I was a legal ward with no independent capacity. In the eyes of the digital world, Astraea Thorne had been unplugged. I tried to log into my bank app on my laptop, only to see the dreaded red text, "Account closed. Contact your administrator." The greatest theft isn't money, but the proof that you ever existed at all. In 2026 America, without a digital footprint, you aren't just a prisoner, you are a ghost. Have you ever felt the world continue to turn while you were suddenly, violently made invisible? I found my passport tucked into the back of a bookshelf, but as I opened it, my stomach dropped. The pages had been systematically mutilated, not just stolen, but shredded within the cover. This wasn't a robbery, it was a ritual. Cyprian didn't just want my silence, he wanted my total erasure. He wanted to ensure that even if I escaped the physical walls of this mansion, I would never be able to cross a border or prove my name. I stared at the ruined ink and realized that by trying to make me a ghost, they had inadvertently given me the power to move unseen through their world. That's where the hunt changed. I forced myself to stop shaking. I sat on the floor and looked toward the corner of the room where my grandfather's old wooden toys were kept. To my mother, Lavinia, they were junk I refused to throw away. To my sister, Malis, they were reminders of a senile old man. But I knew better. I reached for a small, hand-carved wooden owl, its glass eyes reflecting the dim moonlight filtering through the security bars on my window. I twisted the owl's head 3 times to the left, then pressed the signet ring I still wore against the base. A faint, high-frequency hum vibrated through the floorboards. The glass eye system, an air-gapped surveillance network my grandfather had installed decades ago, flickered to life. He had been a man of deep foresight, a man who understood that a family built on greed would eventually turn on its own blood. I pulled a hidden tablet from the false back of a picture frame and watched the screen glow with live feeds from the library downstairs. Evil often forgets that the things it ignores are the very things that will eventually bury it. On the screen, I saw Cyprian pouring a glass of scotch, his posture relaxed, the arrogance of a victor radiating from his shoulders. Milas was there too, pacing the rug with a predatory energy. "The guardianship is finalized," Cyprian said, his voice cold and devoid of any fatherly warmth. "Once she's transferred to the facility in Vermont, the board will have no choice but to release the trust funds to cover the Thorne Global shortfalls." Miley smiled, a sharp, jagged expression. "And if she has an unfortunate accident during the transfer? Grief is so unpredictable after all." I recorded every word, my knuckles whitening as I held the tablet. They were siphoning funds from the trust to cover criminal losses, discussing my life as if it were a line item on a balance sheet. I felt a surge of pity for them. They were so busy counting my grandfather's money that they had completely forgotten the man's soul. To forgive doesn't mean allowing them to hurt me again. It means refusing to let their poison change who I am. I looked at a faded photo of Grandpa Thorne on my desk. His paranoia wasn't a symptom of age. It was a profound act of love to protect the only Thorne who still had a conscience. I accessed the private, air-gapped server hidden deep within the estate's physical library, using a sequence only I knew. It wasn't something a hacker could find because it relied on physical switches and manual memory. My grandfather had taught me that in a world of digital lies, the only truth is what you can touch. I began uploading the recordings, setting a digital dead man's switch that would alert Soren Voss the moment my heart rate or location left a preset perimeter. If I was going to be a ghost, I was going to be a ghost with a haunting presence. The distant sound of laughter drifted from the hallway, Lavinia and Maelys, celebrating their success with a bottle of wine. They thought I was upstairs, broken and drugged, waiting to be discarded. They didn't realize that the walls of this house were now listening to them, recording their greed for a higher court. Looking at the mutilated remains of my passport, I understood. I hadn't just been excluded. I had been weaponized. The family I once loved had decided they no longer needed to remember me, so I would make sure the law never forgot them. I didn't know what was waiting for me next, but for the first time since the gala, the air in my lungs felt clear. Dignity is a quiet flame. You can try to blow it out, but if the wick is made of truth, it will only burn brighter in the dark. I sat in the shadows of my room, watching the feeds, a silent sentinel in a house of thieves. The pre-dawn darkness of the North Shore felt heavier than usual, a thick blanket of humid air that clung to the windows of my locked attic room. I sat in the corner, the only light provided by the dim glow of my grandfather's modified tablet, watching the glass eye feed with the detachment of a ghost. Downstairs in the mahogany-lined library, Cyprian Thorne was pouring another glass of cognac, his face illuminated by the dying embers of the fireplace. He looked triumphant, almost relaxed, as if he had already spent the trust funds that still legally sat behind a wall of encryption he couldn't hope to crack. Have you ever watched someone celebrate a victory that was built on a foundation of sand? I found myself almost pitying his short-sightedness. He was so obsessed with the crown that he hadn't noticed the throne was being dismantled beneath him. The heavy Chicago rain began to lash against the glass, a rhythmic drumming that masked the sound of a window latch clicking open behind me. I didn't flinch. I had been expecting a visitor, though most people would find it impossible to scale 3 stories of wet limestone in a thunderstorm. A shadow detached itself from the darkness, moving with the professional grace of a man who had navigated the world's most dangerous boardrooms and back alleys. Soren Voss stood in the center of the room, his dark raincoat dripping onto the hardwood, his eyes scanning the space for threats before finally settling on me. We didn't waste time on platitudes or frantic greetings. True trust isn't a blind leap. It's a calculated decision to believe in the integrity of a soul when everyone else is selling theirs. He gave me a single, sharp nod of respect, and in that silent exchange, the alliance grandfather built decades ago was reaffirmed. He didn't speak until he had checked the door's lock and ensured my surveillance jammer was functioning. "Astraea, the family has already moved the court date up," he whispered, his voice as steady as a surgeon's. "They want the guardianship finalized by the end of the week." He reached into a hidden pocket of his jacket and pulled out a weathered crimson folder, placing it on the desk next to the wooden owl. Alongside it, he set down a heavy gold signet ring. The real one. The one the family thought had been buried with my grandfather. My heart skipped a beat as I touched the cold metal. It was more than jewelry. It was a master key to a legacy of defiance. The crimson file was the sword of justice I had been waiting for. As I flipped through the pages, the rapid-fire exchange of data between Soren and me felt like the ticking of a countdown clock. The revelation was staggering. Through an air-gapped shell company my grandfather had created specifically for this scenario, I currently owned 60% of Thorne Global's outstanding corporate debt. My father wasn't just my oppressor. He was effectively my tenant and my debtor. I held the legal power to foreclose on his entire life, his career, and the very mansion we were standing in. All with a single filing in a Delaware court. I handled the signet ring with reverence, noting that its power isn't in its gold, but in the authority it grants over the Thorne Foundation's hidden assets. Soren leaned in, his expression grim. "We can end this tonight, Astraea. We trigger the default, freeze every account tied to Thorne Global, and let the bank's security teams walk Cyprian out in handcuffs by breakfast. It's a scorched earth approach. They wouldn't even have time to pack their bags." I looked at the screen, watching my father's arrogant posture, then at the ring in my hand. The temptation to ruin him instantly, to see the shock on his face as he lost everything, was a hot, sharp pull in my chest. But power doesn't change who you are. It simply removes the mask you've been wearing. I am my grandfather's seed, and he never believed in destruction for the sake of vengeance. "No," I said, my voice barely a breath, but carrying the weight of an ultimate decision. "A scorched earth policy only leaves a wasteland. I want the truth, not just the ashes." I explained that a surgical approach was necessary to preserve the honor of the Thorne name for the sake of the charity work grandfather started. Under the Illinois legal system, if I foreclosure now, it looks like a hostile corporate raid. But if I let the guardianship hearing proceed, I can trap Cyprian in a web of perjury. When he testifies under oath that the company is solvent while I hold the debt notices, his own greed becomes his executioner. Soren watched me for a long moment, a faint glimmer of pride in his eyes. He understood that my stoic refusal to become the monster I was fighting was my greatest strength. He began detailing the technical plan, how the debt notices would be served mid-hearing, and how Judge Thorne Vane, a man of unshakable ethics who had his own history with my grandfather, would be the one to preside. We were setting a trap that required me to remain a prisoner for just a few days longer. I would have to endure their mockery, their drugs, and their Judas kisses while carrying the weight of an empire in my pocket. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the Chicago sky, Soren prepared to leave. He helped me hide the crimson file and the signet ring back into the dead space behind the wall paneling, a hollowed-out section of the architecture that even the most thorough house sweep would miss. I knew that my mother, Lavinia, would soon be knocking on my door, bringing with her a poisoned version of love and a new set of shackles. I had to be ready to play the role of the fragile, broken daughter one last time. Soren paused at the window, looking back at me. "It's going to get harder before it gets easier, Astraea. They're going to hit you with everything they have." I stood tall, the cold weight of the ring's secrets still warm against my memory. "Let them," I replied. "You can only bury someone if they're already dead. I've never been more alive." I watched him disappear into the Chicago rain, the silence of the room returning like an old friend. I was a ghost in a house of thieves, but I was a ghost who now owned the walls. The sunset over Lake Michigan was a bruised purple, bleeding into a cold, indifferent gray as it slipped beneath the horizon. From my attic window, I watched the shadows stretch across the lawn like grasping fingers, reaching for a legacy that was never meant for them. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. I sat at my grandfather's oak desk, my posture straight, my breathing measured. Tomorrow morning, the courtroom doors of Cook County would open, and my family would attempt to legally bury Astraea Thorne alive. I wasn't afraid. Fear is a reaction to the unknown, but I knew exactly who they were. I knew every jagged edge of their greed, every hollow cavern of their hearts. A soft, rhythmic clicking echoed in the hallway, the sound of designer heels on hardwood. I didn't turn around when the door creaked open. The scent arrived first. A cloying cloud of expensive rosewater and sterile lavender. It was my mother's signature, a fragrance designed to project elegance while masking the rot of 1,000 small betrayals. Lavinia Thorne entered the room carrying a silver tray with a single porcelain cup of tea. Her face was a masterpiece of manufactured sorrow, her eyes rimmed with just enough redness to suggest a mother's sleepless nights. She moved with a practiced, intimate grace, placing the tray on my desk with a hand that trembled ever so slightly, a detail she surely spent minutes perfecting in front of her vanity mirror. "Astraea, darling," she whispered, her voice a fragile reed in the wind. "I couldn't sleep knowing you were up here all alone, thinking we don't care." She reached out, her fingers brushing my cheek with a coldness that made my skin crawl. I watched her micro-expressions in the reflection of the window glass. Her gaze flitted to the clock every few seconds, timing her performance as if she had a curtain call to catch. A mother's arms are supposed to be a sanctuary, but in this house, they have always been a cage. We don't choose our blood, but we do choose our boundaries. I accepted the tea, the steam rising in thin, mocking curls, but I didn't drink. I set it down on the edge of a coaster, maintaining a stoic politeness that I knew was driving her to the edge of frustration. She wanted an outburst. She wanted me to scream or cry so she could tell the court I was emotionally volatile. I gave her nothing but a calm, steady stare. "You look so much like your grandfather today," she continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hum. "He was so stubborn at the end, too. He didn't understand that we were only trying to protect the Thorne name." She reached into the pocket of her silk robe and pulled out a small velvet box. "I found this in the safe. It was meant to be a gift for your graduation, but everything was so chaotic then. I think he'd want you to have it tonight, to remind you that you're still a part of us." She opened the box to reveal a beautiful, antique gold bracelet, its links intricately carved with delicate ivy patterns. It looked like a piece of history, a gesture of reconciliation. I felt a sudden, sharp spike in the atmosphere, a high-stakes tension that made the air in the room feel thin. Lavinia insisted on clasping the bracelet onto my wrist herself. As she bent over my hand, I heard it. A faint, mechanical click that was far too heavy for a simple jewelry clasp. It wasn't the sound of gold meeting gold, it was the sound of a lock engaging. The weight of the metal was wrong. It pressed against my pulse point with a cold, insistent pressure. My mind raced through the technical schematics Soren had shared with me. This wasn't just a family heirloom. It was a biometric tracker equipped with a permanent tamper-proof lock. A shackle gilded in Thorne gold. Lavinia's mask didn't just slip. It dissolved. She straightened up, her manufactured sorrow replaced by a chilling, predatory satisfaction. "Now, even your heartbeat belongs to the Thorne name, Astraea," she whispered, leaning so close I could see the tiny, broken capillaries in her eyes. "This little beauty monitors your GPS, your heart rate, and your cortisol levels. Every time you panic in that courtroom tomorrow, every time your heart flutters with fear, it will be recorded and transmitted directly to our legal team's tablet. By the time the judge sees the data, he'll have all the proof he needs that you are a danger to your own health. You won't be running away to your little allies anymore." The horror of the betrayal was absolute. A digital Judas kiss intended to use my own biology against me. But she had made a fatal mistake. She assumed I was still the child who sought her approval. I didn't plead. I didn't try to tear the metal from my skin. Instead, I stood up, my movements slow and deliberate, towering over her as I looked her in the eye with a profound, quiet pity. "I am sorry that you believe love requires a lock to stay, Mother," I said, my voice as steady as the deep lake waters. "You didn't give me a bracelet. You gave me a reason to never look back. Grandfather once said that the saddest person in the room is the one who thinks they own the room. I look at you now, and I see how truly empty your world has become." I touched her hand briefly, noting how she flinched at my lack of fear. Her skin was as cold as the marble in the hallway. I hope one day you find a peace that doesn't require someone else's misery, I added. My mind was already filing this away under the crimson file. Under Illinois law, forced biometric monitoring without a court order is a gross violation of civil rights and privacy. They had just handed me the final piece of the puzzle, evidence of physical and psychological coercion that would make the guardianship petition look like a criminal conspiracy. They thought they were gathering data on my weakness. They were actually documenting their own cruelty. Lavinia backed toward the door, her eyes wide with a mix of confusion and mounting rage. She expected a victim. She found a judge. We'll see how brave you are tomorrow when the doors close and the world forgets you exist. She spat before slamming the door. I heard the bolt slide into place, but I didn't move. I looked down at the golden shackle on my wrist, the heavy biometric lock pulsing against my skin like a second, unwanted heart. I walked over to the wooden owl in the corner and smiled faintly. Soren was watching. The tracker's data, intended to prove my instability, would instead provide a time-stamped record of my mother's illegal intrusion. I realized that was the moment the Thorne family died in my eyes. Not because they were greedy, but because they had lost the ability to see the humanity in their own blood. I spent the rest of the night breathing in a forced, meditative rhythm, keeping my heart rate low and steady so as not to give them the anxiety data they desperately craved. I was no longer a victim. I was a silent watchman, waiting for the dawn. I spent the night breathing in a forced rhythm, knowing that tomorrow, the courthouse doors would open not only for a hearing, but also for the funeral of the family I once loved. The Cook County Courthouse was a mausoleum of cold marble and echoing silence, a place where the air felt thin and tasted of old paper and suppressed desperation. I sat in a wheelchair, a prop my family had insisted upon to visually broadcast my supposed instability to the world. Every squeak of the rubber wheels on the polished stone floor felt like a needle pricking my skin. My father, Cyprian Thorne, sat at the petitioner's table, leaning back with a confidence so thick it was suffocating. He radiated the aura of a man who believed justice was just another commodity he could purchase and rebrand. Beside him, Milis fidgeted with the diamond face of her watch, her eyes darting everywhere except toward mine. Justice is not a statue with a blindfold. It is a living thing that requires the courage of those willing to speak the truth when the lies are loud enough to shatter glass. The bailiff called the court to order, and the heavy doors at the back groaned open. Vane entered the room, his black robes flowing behind him like a storm cloud. He didn't look at the lawyers or the gallery. He looked directly at me. I noticed a slight, almost imperceptible whitening of my father's knuckles as he gripped the edge of the table. It was the first sign of a crack in his armor. The instinct of a predator realizing the cage might not be as empty as he thought. I maintained a stoic silence, my back straight despite the uncomfortable chair, my hands folded over the golden bracelet that pulsed against my wrist. I felt like a sacrifice being led into a grand arena, yet the fire inside me had never burned colder. The prosecution began their assault with a surgical precision that would have been impressive if it weren't so hollow. Cyprian's lead counsel stood before the bench, gesturing toward me with a pitying shake of his head as he presented a series of doctored medical reports. They brought forth a paid psychiatrist who spoke in hushed, clinical tones about my detachment from reality and my unstable emotional baseline. Each word was a brick in a wall they were building around my freedom. During a brief sidebar, the room became a blur of motion, but my focus remained locked. My mother, Lavinia, leaned in close to me, her perfume cloying and sweet, masking the rot of her words. "Look at this room, Astraea," she whispered, her face a mask of maternal grief for the benefit of the cameras. "Everyone here sees a broken girl. By tonight, you'll be locked away in a place where no one can hear you scream, and your grandfather's money will finally be in capable hands." I felt the biometric bracelet on my wrist pulse with a frantic rhythm, a digital lie designed to tell the world I was breaking. Lavinia watched me, waiting for the sob, the tremor, the panic attack that would seal my fate. Instead, I forced my heart rate into a meditative calm, drawing on the strength of the seeds my grandfather had planted in my mind years ago. "You think you're burying me, Mother," I replied, my voice a quiet, devastating grace that barely carried to her ears. "You've forgotten that I am my grandfather's seed. We don't die in the dark. We grow." The lawyer then pivoted to his final strike, a move designed to destroy my character along with my liberty. He introduced a shocking bank transfer history, claiming I had siphoned millions from the Thorne Global accounts to fund a manic escape plan. It was a masterpiece of forgery, a final trap to ensure that even if the judge doubted my insanity, he would brand me a criminal. They weren't just taking my freedom, they were erasing my name. I looked at Vane, whose expression remained impassive as he flipped through the documents. I knew he was waiting for the right moment, his eyes lingering on the biometric shackle on my wrist. A piece of evidence the prosecution had neglected to mention was forced upon me. Cyprian leaned forward, a predatory smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He thought he had won. He believed that the weight of his lies had finally crushed the truth out of the air. The loudest lies often come from those who are most afraid of the silence that follows the truth, and I was simply waiting for the silence to begin. I didn't defend myself. I didn't cry out. I watched as my sister and father shared a look of triumph, already spending the legacy they hadn't earned. I sat there, a silent sentinel in the heart of their storm, knowing that Soren Voss was somewhere in the back of the room, his thumb hovering over a different kind of trigger. The courtroom air felt heavy, charged with the electricity of a coming storm. The lawyer reached the climax of his argument, his voice rising to a fever pitch as he demanded my immediate commitment to a high-security psychiatric facility. He was so caught up in his own performance that he didn't notice Judge Vane's hand hovering over a small red light on his bench, a signal for an incoming emergency filing. The transition was so sharp it felt like a physical blow. The judge leaned forward, his voice cutting through the lawyer's shouting like a razor through silk. "Enough, counselor," Vane said, his tone dropping an octave into a register of cold authority. The room froze. My father's smile faltered, his posture stiffening as the judge's gaze shifted from the documents to me. It wasn't a look of pity or clinical curiosity. It was a look of profound, uncharacteristic respect. "Before we proceed to the medical mandate," Vane continued, his eyes locked onto mine, "I have received an emergency digital filing from the Thorne Legacy Trust that takes legal precedence over this entire petition. It appears we have been operating under several grave misconceptions regarding the ownership of the Thorne assets." I felt the golden shackle on my wrist pulse one last time before it went cold, the lie finally reaching its expiration date. The atmosphere in courtroom 402 was no longer just tense. It had become an airless vacuum of suffocating suspense. I watched my father's arrogant smile falter as the judge's gaze shifted from the documents to me, a look of profound, uncharacteristic respect that chilled the air in the room. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of breathless quiet that felt like the world had stopped spinning on its axis. Every eye in the gallery was fixed on the figure in black robes, waiting for the storm to break. Judge Thorne Vane stood up from his mahogany bench, but he didn't call for a recess or signal the bailiff. Instead, he ignored the confused murmurs of the Thorne legal team and began a slow, deliberate descent into the well of the courtroom. This was a radical breach of standard American court protocol, a sovereign movement that signaled a shift in the very laws governing this space. I sat perfectly still, my breathing shallow, as the judge walked past my father's instinctively outstretched hand. He didn't even glance at Cyprian. He stopped directly in front of my wheelchair, his expression one of solemn, almost ancient reverence. Then, the unthinkable happened. Thorne Vane performed a deep, formal bow of 90 degrees, a gesture of submission and profound respect reserved for a superior or a high benefactor. Grandfather used to say that some people demand respect, while others are simply built of it. Today, the building finally recognized its architect. In that moment, the power dynamic of the Thorne family didn't just crack, it was utterly obliterated. I saw Lavinia's face turn a ghostly, translucent white, her hands trembling so violently that her designer handbag slipped from her lap and hit the floor with a hollow thud. Cyprian stood frozen, his mouth open as if to speak, but the words had died in his throat. I didn't wait for permission. I reached down to my wrist and unhooked the golden biometric shackle. It fell away with a light clatter, the red light on its surface finally dark. Soren Voss had remotely deactivated the lock minutes prior, but the physical act of removing it felt like shed skin. I slowly stood up from the wheelchair, my legs steady, my spine a line of unyielding steel. I was Astraea Thorne, and I was no longer a ward of the state or a prisoner of my blood. Judge Vane returned to his position, his voice cutting through the stunned silence like a thunderclap. The court has reviewed the emergency digital filing submitted by the Thorne Legacy Trust, he announced, his eyes sweeping over my family with a cold, judgmental fire. It appears that the petitioner, Mr. Cyprian Thorne, has failed to disclose critical information regarding the current ownership of Thorne Global and the very grounds we stand upon. He picked up a sheet of paper that carried the official seal of the Illinois Department of Finance. Astraea Thorne, through the Legacy Trust, is the sole owner of the holding company that currently carries 90% of Thorne Global's outstanding debt, Vane read, his voice gaining strength. Furthermore, the trust is the actual leaseholder of this courthouse. Mr. Thorne, you are not here to claim a guardianship. You are here to answer to your primary creditor. The legal reality hit the room like a physical blow. Under U.S. commercial law, my distressed asset acquisition was a masterstroke of corporate strategy. I had bought my father's life out from under him while he was busy trying to prove I was mentally incapable of owning a checkbook. I stepped forward, my voice calm and clear, carrying to every corner of the room. You tried to prove I was mentally incapable of managing my life, Father? I said, looking directly into his sunken, terrified eyes. But you failed to realize that for the last 48 hours I have been managing your bankruptcy. You were so focused on the legacy you thought you inherited that you never bothered to read the fine print of the man who actually built it. Mylis tried to speak, a desperate, shrill sound, but I silenced her with a single glance. The money you siphoned to cover your criminal losses? It was tracked the moment it left the account, I continued. Every lie you told, every document you forged, it's all there in the crimson file. I wasn't speaking out of hatred. Anger is a hot coal that burns the one who holds it, and I had no intention of being burned. I was here for restoration. I was here to return the Thorne name to the integrity it lost the day my grandfather's heart stopped beating. I turned my gaze to Lavinia, who was shrinking into her seat, her cloying perfume now smelling only of fear. Mother, you told me I was a ghost, I said softly, the pity I felt for her finally outweighing the pain she had caused. But ghosts don't hate, they only haunt. I won't haunt you, but I will no longer allow you to haunt me. You lived your life behind a mask, but today, the mask has been removed for everyone to see. The emotional punchline hung in the air. I didn't win because I have more money. I won because I realized that the only person who can truly give me my worth is me. My family had spent their lives trying to define me by my silence, but they never realized that silence is where a storm gathers its strength. I stood in the center of that courtroom, a woman who had reclaimed her identity, her dignity, and her future from the very people who tried to bury her. Judge Vane leaned forward, his gavel hovering over the bench. This court finds the guardianship petition to be not only without merit, but a fraudulent abuse of the legal system, he declared. We will now transition to a preliminary hearing regarding the evidence of criminal fraud, forgery, and biometric abuse. Bailiffs, please ensure the petitioners remain in the room. This is no longer a civil matter. It is a criminal indictment. As the judge's gavel pounded the wooden floor like thunder, I looked at my father and saw not a king, but a man about to realize that his entire empire was built on the foundations I now held. The atmosphere in courtroom 402, once thick with his arrogance, suddenly became stifling. Judge Thorne Vane stood tall, his voice firm as he ordered the charges of criminal fraud to be made public immediately. The heavy oak doors at the back of the room swung open, and federal agents moved forward with deadly silence. I reached into the crimson file, pulling out the digital trace of the embezzled funds from Thorne Global. Evidence so clear and undeniable it felt like watching a shattered glass wall in slow motion. Cyprian Thorne stared at me, his eyes wide, reflecting a terror I had never seen in him before. His skin, once bronzed by expensive vacations, turned a deathly, translucent gray. He looked at the federal agents, then at the judge, and finally back at me, realizing he was stripped of his title, his wealth, and his dignity in a single breath. His legs, the pillars of his perceived power, simply gave way. He dropped to his knees on the cold marble floor, not in a gesture of prayer, but in a state of total, absolute defeat. I expected to feel a surge of triumph, but all I felt was the cold silence of a house that was never a home. You cannot build a throne on the bones of your children and expect it to stand forever. Behind him, Lavinia and Malus were frozen, their faces masks of stunned disbelief, as they were escorted out for questioning regarding the biometric abuse and the forgery. I stood up and walked toward my father, stopping just inches from where he knelt. I didn't mock him. I didn't shout. I simply offered him a gaze of profound, final detachment. It was the look of a person who had finally stepped out of a shadow. Character isn't just what we do when we win. It's the mercy we show when we have every reason to be cruel. I watched the agents lead him away, his head bowed, a broken man who had traded his soul for a ledger that was now empty. Outside the courthouse, the Chicago wind was sharp, but it no longer felt like it was trying to cut me. Soren Voss waited by the steps, his expression unreadable to the world, but containing a flicker of deep respect for me. I paused to sign the final documents, not to seize my family's personal belongings, but to officially dissolve the corporate rot of Thorne Global. I ensured that Lavinia and Malus were provided with a modest, legally protected living allowance, provided they never contacted me again. My grandfather used to say that the saddest person in the room is the one who thinks they own it. I was leaving that room behind. I'm not finishing their story, Soren, I said, looking at the city skyline. I'm starting mine. As we walked toward the car, I stopped to help an elderly woman who had tripped on the courthouse steps, her papers scattering in the wind. I knelt on the concrete, gathering the pages with the same steady hands that had just dismantled an empire. It was a simple act, but it felt more significant than any legal victory. My power was no longer rooted in the Thorne name or the weight of a signet ring. It was rooted in the quiet, unyielding service of a woman who had found her own worth. Months passed like a slow, healing breath. The Chicago winter broke, giving way to a serene spring morning that smelled of damp earth and blooming lilacs. I stood on the expansive front porch of the Thorne estate, the very place where I had once been shamed and hidden away. But the gates were gone. The high-security cameras had been replaced by flower baskets, and the sign at the end of the long driveway now read, "The Second Porch Sanctuary." It was no longer a fortress of greed. It was a haven for women and children who had been erased by the very people who were supposed to protect them. I watched a group of children playing in the gardens my grandfather had loved, their laughter filling the air like music. The house was full of light and the sound of new life. I once believed I had been forgotten, then erased. Now I realize I was simply being prepared. My family thought they were burying a secret. They didn't realize they were planting a seed. I ran my thumb over the empty space on my wrist where the golden shackle used to be. The skin had healed, and so had I.